Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, minister, and friend, Chino Ross, pastor and the voice of the Understanding Scripture and Truth by Chino D. Ross YouTube channel. Chino, it's good to be back, and hopefully you're thawing out. We are here. Last episode, I mentioned we had the big blizzard come through. We had a second one come through, so it's insanely deep in my driveway, but we have a 4x4 and we're able to get around. But hopefully you're doing okay in your neck of the woods.
We are, John. I think we owe you a happy birthday, don't we? Didn't you just pass a big milestone? Was it, 73 or what was
74,
the last birthday?
Yeah, 70. Not going to tell. I'll let everybody guess my age. Everybody always guessed, and they're either way too high or way too low, which is, the too high is really funny to me, but the too low I feel a little bit privileged for. But yeah, so by the time this podcast comes out, it will be way past my birthday, but I did have a birthday celebration, and my brother and sister-in-law escaped the cult, and their family comes over, and they're my family here, so they come and celebrate, and we had a good time, and almost as much of a good time as we're about to have talking about Hobart Freeman and the cults.
Well, what we've been looking at for a long time, John, a long time, are some of the signs that I mentioned back this fall that showed me that Hobart was just losing touch with reality. I think as he was losing grip on reality, the grip and control of the church became even tighter. And I don't think he was going crazy or anything like that. It's just he really saw himself and his church as something special, something elite, and they were really beginning to experience all of this difficulty in the summer and the fall of 1984. And they hadn't had a lot of that before. I think whenever Bruce Kinsey, his son-in-law, who was second in command, decided to leave, that really showed some vulnerability, a chink in the armor, by Bruce standing up to Hobart, yelling at him, saying you're wrong, saying you need deliverance. I was bombarding Hobart with letters at that time. We're going to play a clip from that in a future episode. And we've already talked about the change in laws in Indiana. Now the state can actually go after some of these people. And the Halls and the Bergmans were two of the first couples who were tried and convicted in regard to the death of somebody in their family. So the walls were just closing in. I can say, thankfully, when you look back on the time period of Faith Assembly, it wasn't that long. Not every cult leader goes down this quickly. I just think there were so many good Christian people under this ministry that if God didn't do something about the leadership and the direction, then so many more people would have been hurt and would have died. So over the last, I don't know how many months, we've talked about just a variety of legalisms. I thought I would just end it with this. You've heard of the 10 Commandments, right? Moses came down from Mount Sinai with 2 tablets of stone carved with the finger of God, and he had 10 commandments. How would you like to have Faith Assembly's list of commandments? These are their commandments to be in fellowship with Faith Assembly. And I dare anybody to hold their breath until I get to the end of this. You can't watch TV. You can't go watch movies. You can't listen to secular music or join a club or be in a union or play sports or work in the medical field or the dental field or law or banking or psychology or social services or education or government or law enforcement. Can't go to a doctor or a dentist or take medicine or wear glasses. You can't wear pants if you're a woman, or lipstick or makeup or jewelry, or have pierced ears, or carry purses with shoulder-length straps. Women have to stay at home. Children have to stay quiet. No one can wear Nike tennis shoes or flannel shirts or white duck overalls or T-shirts with slogans or use abbreviations like condo for condominium, or U.S. Ag Department for United States Agricultural Department. The act of marriage is for procreation and conception only, not for pleasure. So no foreplay, no birth control, no borrowing money, no investments, no college, no hunting, no holidays, no birthday celebration. 10 Commandments, I don't even know how many we have right here, but this is what you had to do to be in fellowship with Faith Assembly. They taught the people, let's separate rather than unite, quarrel rather than love, pride over humility, denounce fallen members rather than restore them. Let's major on the minors and minor on the majors. Be a good Pharisee like me and walk on the other side of the road. And by all means, do not touch God's anointed.
Every time I think about the cults and I think about the 10 Commandments, I don't know if you've seen the clip or not, but there's a Mel Brooks movie called History of the World Part 1, and Moses walks out and he's got 3 sets of tablets instead of 2, and he drops one, and he's walking out saying, and here are the 5th, and he drops it. He started to say 15, and then he changed it to 10 Commandments. Well, I always think of this when I think about the cults because they've added so many man-made rules, and the humor, I know a lot of people say that that's sacrilegious, but if you ever grew up in a cult like this that was so far based on legalism that they were making up rules to to enforce the rules, that's how bad it was. You can't help but laugh at that kind of humor, and I do. I laugh at it. So I know I'm labeled as sacrilegious by some because I share it every now and then. But it's exactly right, man. If you go to my website and you type in just the word rules in the search bar, you'll see everything that I went through one day. I didn't capture them all by no means, but I caught maybe 50 ridiculous rules. It's everything from men can't wear suede shoes to women can't use dishwashers. And what I found, it was a good exercise. And if you've ever been in a legalistic cult that has the recordings, I say that you should go through that exercise because you start to pick up on this, how they came to be. These are ridiculous rules, and usually they come in the form of rants. The person will get angry and they get so full of themselves and they're just spouting off rules for the sake of rules, which is strongly tied to what we're talking about today. You create this fantasy world basically, and you're entering in the realm of a religion that is describing something that truly does not exist, but everybody's kind of morphed into it. And the psychology behind it to me is fascinating because when it starts, everybody thinks it's a good thing. And as the rules keep coming and people start to realize there's really no sense to any of this, the people start to get angry, but they're in that groupthink, that mindset. The people have helped mold what it became. That's the interesting part about all of this. It's fascinating. But then it reaches a point where some of the people start to say, hey, wait a minute, this is ridiculous. And the fights start to break out. And we'll get into it more, but it's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think you described it really well, John. And I'm sure I left out a lot of legalisms just from Faith Assembly. You add in your group from Branham followers and all of these other groups. And, I think you described it really well. It starts off innocently enough and people are excited about what they're hearing and learning. And, maybe there's a new little distinctive here, like, oh, you're not allowed to do this. And they've never heard that before in their denominational church. And so these people are wanting closer walk with God and obedience to his word. And it's appealing to them. They think, oh, well, here's something I missed in my Christian life, and I need to be obedient to this. And then they find out later, it's not even something in the Bible. It's just a man-made idea. And you're right. The more of these that come, the more elitism enters that group because we know no one outside the group has any of this stuff and we have it all. And so you feel really good about yourself and you feel not really sorry, but it's just too bad for all the people outside of the group that don't have your light and understanding. And then the minister sees he's got all these people in the palm of his hand, that they're obeying him on all these little things. And he comes up with some more ideas. And as you and I have consistently said, just go back to the New Testament itself and find what was the early church like? What did the apostles require of them? I mean, the number one thing was to walk in the grace and love and mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ. It wasn't to walk in all of these laws and legalisms. So that was one, Hobart losing touch with reality, I think, losing touch mentally with reality, believing his own propaganda. One of the things that was going to lead to the downfall of Faith Assembly, people had begun to see some of the problems. Only a few people were willing to do anything about it. Bruce Kinsey was one who left over the hunting issue. You know, I was just a person on the outside objecting to all kinds of things that I thought sounded like legalisms to me. And I think there were people in the church that were uncomfortable with it, but you know, what do you do? If you leave Faith Assembly, you leave Christianity, according to Hobart's teaching. I mean, he literally said that. And I think all cults teach that. You know, you leave us, you've left God. And so even the people that told me, well, I did not agree with the hunting mandate, no hunting, you know, I submitted to my pastor, laid down my own thoughts and reservations and went along with it, which I've said before, that's the worst thing you can do, to cave in to the false teaching of a cult leader. You got to stand up to it. So a second thing was coming down the pipeline in 1984 that was going to begin also to cause big problems. That's what we're going to discuss today, John. And that concerned a civil lawsuit that was filed by a law firm up in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit, up on Lake St. Clair, in February of this year, 1984. The Fort Wayne News Sentinel newspaper did a story on it that people can look up. It was printed on February the 3rd of 1984 that began to give some of the details of this particular lawsuit. It was filed, as I say, by a legal firm up in Michigan on behalf of a couple in Illinois, David Olson and his wife. They were the basis for the lawsuit, and the reason that the lawsuit was filed, as I say, it's a civil one and not a criminal one, was because this woman, David Olson's wife, had begun attending Steve Hill's. He was also a son-in-law of Dr. Freeman, married to Dr. Freeman's oldest daughter. Steve Hill had a big meeting up in Rockford, Illinois. Steve originally had the Friday night meeting at the Glory Barn in North Webster, Indiana, but right after Bruce got saved, Bruce was a big draw. He's an ex-Marine sergeant, dramatic conversion experience. He was given the Friday night Glory Barn meeting, and Steve, I think, really wanted to go up and concentrate on this Rockford, Illinois group, so that's where he went. And Mrs. Olson began to attend that meeting in March of 1981. So she has been there, 2.5 or 3 years by the time this lawsuit is filed. And what the lawsuit was over, the allegations were, I'm just going to read some of these quickly and then explain a couple of them. The allegations included fraud and deceit, false imprisonment, involuntary servitude, clergyman malpractice, negligence, negligent infliction of emotional distress, intentional infliction of emotional distress, invasion of privacy, violation of civil rights, and outrageous conduct. And you'd have to be an attorney to know even what all those things mean. But that's the first time a major civil lawsuit that was after money. They said, we're after money and we're after Dr. Freeman's assets. Of course, Hobart Freeman's still alive at this time. And so the Fort Wayne paper did an article on that, and they later did another article that gave a little more explanation of how the attorneys, what they were after in each of these allegations that they made. So for instance, with the fraud and deceit, and this, I think you'll find what they were after, which with each of these, pretty interesting. I quote, "The nature of Faith Assembly's practices was kept secret from Mrs. Olson. The techniques of mind control and coercive persuasion were by no means made known to her." Well, of course not. I mean, no cult's going to say, hey, we're practicing mind control on you.
Probably not.
But these attorneys recognize from hearing enough of the cassette tapes, and by the way, we'll get to that here in a few moments, what Faith Assembly did not want entered as evidence at all at the trial were any of the recorded messages of Hobart Freeman at Faith Assembly. I find that just very interesting and fascinating. I can't imagine the Apostle Paul saying, I don't want you to read 1 Corinthians in court because maybe I said something in there that'll get me in trouble. I mean, whatever he wrote and whatever he said, he stood behind, right? But not Faith Assembly, though. False imprisonment. We are alleging she was restrained physically, emotionally, and psychologically. The alienation of affection. The defendants knowingly and willingly caused a division in the Olsen family, causing her to leave her husband. They taught a lot of stuff that if you're going to put husband or parents above Jesus, and Jesus means us, the church, then you can't be saved. You have to put God, which means the church, you have to put the church ahead of everything. And so she ended up leaving her husband. He ended up, this is the backstory, hiring a deprogrammer who had to kidnap her and deprogram her and get her back into the real world. And I don't know how many times that happened, but I'm sure it happened with some of the Branham followers as well.
I have some newspaper articles of it happening on the website. The interesting part is because mind control is something that not everybody fully understands. The trouble you have in court cases, especially those with juries, is that the jury doesn't understand mind control and that they think it's a science fiction. It's not real, but it is real. I am told by the legal experts that I'm working with that if ever there is a case and I'm involved in giving advice to the people who are in the case, that instead use the word undue influence, because everybody understands that. They not all understand mind control.
Yeah, mind control sounds like a cult and sounds spooky, so you probably need a more legally accepted term, which that sounds like a really good one, undue influence. Involuntary servitude. They took control of her services and they prevented her from working. She had been a beautician before. Well, yeah, I mean, women weren't allowed to work outside the home. Woman's place is in the home. The reason she has small feet is so she can stand up at the counter and cook and clean all day. That's basically what those people taught. Negligence. We are alleging that Faith Assembly and all its ministers practice medicine without a license in strict violation of Indiana statutes, that they're also practicing the science of psychology without a license and without any formal education. Oh, wow. My. And you probably aren't going to get, I mean, these are kind of vague charges that, anybody could be guilty of. So you're probably not going to get very far with this.
What's funny is if you've read my book, Weaponized Religion, A Critical Examination of John Alexander Dowie, those are the same exact charges that were leveled against him. And he went through so many court trials. There were so many of the newspaper articles, it got to the point that I quit listing them in the references because he was getting hundreds of lawsuits, and both criminal and civil. And they were trying to stop him from a criminal standpoint, saying that he was practicing medicine without a license because he was telling people to avoid their medicines, just like Freeman was doing. But the problem is, again, you get a jury of people, and they don't really understand that because without understanding the mind control, they would simply ask the people, well, why didn't you just ignore this man and go take your medicine? But in these groups, it's not really that simple.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't think you'd get very far. We've got to remember that this civil lawsuit was filed in the very beginning of 1984 in February. And so that's before the Indiana state legislature had been able to get together and practice or pass laws so that they could go after Faith Assembly from a criminal child neglect position. That's where they knew they would be the most successful. And as we saw from the outcome of all that, they definitely were. Because as I said a moment ago, I mean, you could almost charge anybody, any church with some of these things and, be totally way off base. And you're right, a jury is not going to a jury's not going to have the skill set because they probably don't have the background. Unless you picked everybody who come out of Freeman and Branham background, they don't have the background to know the dangers of this. But I think at the same time, though, we could recognize that any normal church, just the pastor loves the people for the most part. And I know there are exceptions to anything you can say, but for the most part, he's in it for the right reasons. And for the most part, he's doing his best. And for the most part, he's just saying what he thinks the Bible teaches. And for the most part, he's giving everybody the freedom to figure it out on their own. No one is, you have to obey this, or, you just don't even have that in any of these other regular churches. But you go to, as you know, a Branham church, or I know a Freeman church, and these things are just pounded into the people, pounded into the people. So not only was Faith Assembly and Hobart Freeman, really it was Hobart Freeman, because Faith Assembly was nothing. There was no organization, no LLC, no incorporation. Not only was Hobart Freeman named in this civil lawsuit, but so was Bruce Kinsey, so was Steve Hill, so was Tom Hamilton, who was not even in Indiana. He was a pastor of a very well-known and recognized church in Shelbyville, Kentucky, called Shelbyville Christian Assembly. And then there was one other local minister who I think was up in that Illinois area where this woman was attending. And so what I saw happening, and the only way I was able to even know any of this was going on, was I was subscribing, to all these newspapers, because Faith Assembly had cut me off. I couldn't find out anything from them. I couldn't find out anything from people working in the Office of Faith Ministries and Publications. Hobart obviously wasn't talking to me anymore because I had written him a few letters saying, what about this and what about that? So the only way I could find out, John, what was going on is I subscribed to the Warsaw paper and to the Fort Wayne paper. And so every time a paper would come, I got all their papers for several years. Most of the time it's just what's going on in Warsaw and Fort Wayne, Indiana, and I don't care about that. I'd throw those away. I had to read everything to see, did I see the name Faith Assembly or Freeman or lawsuit or anything like that. So, that's how I end up with all these articles. And I have a folder over there just packed full of them. And so it was kind of like interesting for me to check the mail every day and get a newspaper from Indiana. I was living in New England then, just to see, are there any new things happening in northern Indiana that I need to be aware of? Hobart is still alive during this whole time. Hobart's aware of all this. So is Bruce and Steve and Tom Hamilton. And what I began to see happen is these guys, including Hobart, you had just been preaching in your little church in a cornfield. And now it's like, welcome to the power of the United States federal court system. This is not fun and games anymore. You think you can sit in your little meeting and just spout off your nonsense, threatening people and saying, you better not go to the doctor. If you go to the doctor, you've lost your faith and you have no place here anymore. Now, with a federal district court in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and that's why they filed the lawsuit there. They wanted it to be near Faith Assembly, but they wanted to be in a federal district court. I mean, this is the real deal. The real deal, where you have a lawsuit and wow, you have to respond. Hobart lives all the way to the end of this year. So during this year, he's having to deal with all of this, but still he's able, I think, to kind of suppress it in his mind. I'm going to save his comment about this lawsuit to the very end of our interview today, John, where we're going to play that clip and listen to what he actually had to say. But let's just say that he kind of endures this all of the summer and the fall of 1984. He's also witnessing the change in Indiana state laws regarding the neglect of children and dependents who need medical care. He's watched several of his church members be tried, convicted, and sentenced to prison for following his teaching. He's watched Bruce Kinsey leave. He's got bombarded by me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, other people sending letters, making comments. It was a heavy, heavy load for Dr. Freeman. And by the end of the year, he was also very, very ill. That's a whole nother ball of wax that we are going to really dive into here in the near future. He had all kinds of physical problems and illnesses from which he eventually died. And we'll talk about that. But let me just skip over Hobart's dealing with it. We're going to come back to that. Hobart dies in December of 1984. This lawsuit was filed in February of 84. So let's turn the calendar page to 1985. And in May of 1985, the court sent an 80-question interrogatory to the home of June Freeman demanding answers. And it went unanswered by June Freeman. And it's interesting that Hobart taught you got to obey the authorities, Romans 13. You have to obey the local authorities. The court is represented as a legal authority. She's got this list of 80 questions. And what the courts are obviously after are determining what are the assets and where are these assets located. That's what this trial or this lawsuit is all about. So she was sent this 80-question interrogatory and simply did not respond. So in the same year, on August the 28th of 1985, now everyone is back in United States District Court in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The Honorable Judge William Lee presiding. And what the attorneys on behalf of the Olsons are asking for is a freeze of the assets of Hobart Freeman. You know, he passed away 6 months prior to this time. They don't want these assets transferred or hidden or dissipated. They're wanting, let's freeze the assets until we can get to the bottom of everything. Some of the other things that happened at this particular court date, August the 28th of 1985, was that Bruce Kinsey was removed from the lawsuit because he had quit the church. So they took Bruce off the lawsuit. You're no longer under any investigation. They added Faith Ministries and Publications and Faith Radio Ministries, two other arms of Hobart Freeman and the church, thinking that maybe there are some assets being hidden there or transferred one way or the other. So what the judge was having a hard time doing is trying to figure out if there is no corporation, no LLC, no board of directors, if there's no legal entity, then I don't know what it is you're asking me to freeze, because I don't know where the assets are. So he actually denied that motion to freeze the assets because it wasn't like they were in a corporate bank account that he could determine that belonged to Hobart Freeman and therefore freeze it. So what he did is, number one, he ordered June, you have X number of days to answer those questions. And I don't remember, he gave her a few weeks or something to answer those questions. And in the second place, he encouraged the attorneys who had filed the lawsuit to go ahead and get an estate opened in the appropriate county court where Hobart Freeman had died and where he lived. He said, you're going to have to get the estate open there so that we can get to the bottom of how much money is there, which is very interesting, as we will see. How much money is there and where is the money? I mean, is it buried in a coffee can between his back porch and Shoe Lake where he lived? Where exactly is it? And at the same court date, Steve Hill and Tom Hamilton filed a motion for dismissal. They wanted to be dismissed out of the lawsuit because they thought this doesn't have anything to do with me. This is these people against Hobart Freeman. But I think the attorneys for these people were smart enough to realize, attorneys just like get a shotgun and just take a shot and hope they hit something. You've got to include as much as you can to make sure you hit something, because once you file, you file. So the judge did not dismiss but Hill or Hamilton from the lawsuit, but asked them to provide some more documentation. And so what, again, I saw happening at that time is here are two ministers who didn't want anything to do with the long arm of the law. I felt sorry, John, for the people that were tried and convicted, had to go to court over the death of an infant of theirs under new Indiana state law. They were not prepared for that. And if we haven't said, by the way, Faith Assembly's teaching was no attorneys. No attorneys. Hiring an attorney is sin. You have to simply trust God. So you couldn't hire an attorney. No legal representation at all. And I have been to court. I have been through several court proceedings, and I'm not an attorney and don't have any training, but I know that's a lot of complicated stuff. And you think you can do that on your own? I mean, you're probably up a creek without a paddle if you don't have professionals to help you in that area. But again, Faith Assembly was taught you trust God for everything. And Faith Assembly looked at Hobart as though he were an expert on every topic. And and he certainly wasn't. He was going to be up a creek without a paddle when he got to court. I have some other things to say. We'll do it at a later time. But listen, Dr. Freeman did not tell the truth before a judge in court at all. And that is easy to demonstrate. He did not tell the truth at all because he knew, man, if I tell the truth, I'm going down. So you just find a way to worm and weasel your way out of it. And I'll save that for later whenever we go back to the criminal case that he was indicted for. We will get to that a little later.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support. The way that these groups have developed, it's really insidious. We've talked about some of the connections that Hobart Freeman had, from the Full Gospel Businessmen to the Christ for the Nations Institute. I think Charles discovered it was still Branhamism, and it was Branham's Deliverance School that he and Gordon Lindsay were doing. But they teach the theology, and whenever you think about how all of this grew, you're thinking that it grew solely upon men teaching other men and women theology, and then spreading this as a new gospel. But there's more than that. They also spread the strategies to protect themselves, to evade the law, which is insidious, man, because after the issues that happened with Dowie, Dowie was not the only one who got in trouble for this type of faith healing. There were faith healers going across the nation, just scoundrels, peddling whatever it was that they could sell. Some of them with good intentions, but some of them just purely scoundrels. And over time, the groups developed the ways in which to skirt around the laws. And one of them, like you mentioned, there was no organizational structure, there was no corporate assets, etc. A lot of these groups, if they do have a corporation, the corporation is not connected to the child entities. And that's the way the Branham cult headquarters. In fact, recently, I've been putting on the website and on social media, but there was a year-long investigation from the Arizona Daily Star, I think it was, Tucson.com. And they investigated the corporation, the different groups. I think they went to 30 different, subsidiary cult groups, right? And there was no connection back to the top. And when they asked the people in cult headquarters, basically the answer can be summed up as, we don't tell them what to do. We have a do what thou wilt religion. Do as thou wilt. I don't know if you caught that reference, but these groups don't want the legal connections, because if something happens in one of these groups, then the headquarters gets in trouble, and Branham's dead, so he can't get in trouble for it. But while Hobart Freeman was alive, breaking all of those chains of legal responsibility was in his favor.
Yes. I'm hoping you're going to get to interview someone, John, I tried to hook you up with, and I don't think y'all made the connection yet, but he's got an interesting story to tell. I'll let him tell it, but it concerns Tom Hamilton, and it also concerns what you just talked about. If the ministers ever get called on the carpet, they had this disclaimer, oh no, we didn't teach the people to do this. We just read some Bible verses and they did whatever they wanted to do. And that's exactly what Hobart tried to pull in front of the judge. Oh no, I didn't teach any of that. I have my own beliefs, and every person gets to have their own beliefs. But that's not what he taught at all. He taught this is the way of God. And if you don't do this way, you're sinning. Now, is that the same as saying you must do this? I think it is. I think it is. When you say, if you don't do this, you have sinned and lost your salvation. Well, that's a commandment. Whether you verbalize it and say, I am giving you this commandment, when it is couched in those terms, people understand that, just like they understand thou shalt not kill. They understand thou shalt not go to a doctor, and thou shalt not go to a dentist, and thou shalt not wear glasses. And even though Hobart would never say, thou shalt not wear glasses, he would mock you if you put them back on and say you failed your faith tests. So, it's just a lot of wrangling over words, but yeah, we know exactly what they're saying. So at this same hearing, August the 28th of 1985, I thought I would just, Steve Hill was one of the people at the hearing, as was Tom Hamilton and others. And I just thought I would read some of the things that Steve Hill said. Steve Hill was Hobart's son-in-law, the oldest son-in-law, married to the oldest daughter. He became, after a few years, the pastor of Faith Assembly, but not to begin with. We had to get this legal stuff behind us first. And that's an interesting story in itself, which I think we can begin to see here, even in 1985. During the hearing, Hill said, I'm reading from the newspaper article, that faith ministries and faith publications and radio ministries were two names used by Freeman. When questioned, he said he believes the funds generated from these two entities are deposited in the same joint account that had been used by Freeman and his wife, June. Commenting that he has limited knowledge about the financial affairs of Faith Assembly, Hill said he assumes that Mrs. Freeman continues to pay the church bills. We have no leader now, Hill said. He added that since Freeman died, a few ministers took turns delivering weekly sermons at Faith Assembly, and added that he speaks once a month on a Sunday at the building near Wilmot in Noble County. It's no surprise they don't have a leader, and I'm sure what they would say, and maybe they would have said back then, is, well, we were waiting on the Lord to show us who the leader was going to be. There might be a little bit of truth in that, John, but I would warrant the reason they didn't have a leader is because no one wanted to have a target on his back for what was happening with this lawsuit. They were all smart enough to say, I don't want to be the pastor because now I'm in Hobart's shoes. Now everyone's going to come after me. So we call that cowardice. That's just a lack of courage. He'll maintain that Faith Assembly is not an organization and noted that it has no board of directors or officers. Hobart was famous for saying, we are an organism. The body of Christ, the local church, is an organism, not an organization. So we don't have a board, and we don't elect a board, and we don't have a president. This is a theocracy ruled by God, i.e. me. This is a theocracy, and I'm the head of it, and what I say goes, and that is exactly the way Faith Assembly was patterned.
Yeah.
Is that true with some of these other Branham groups too?
Absolutely. Any time that one of these groups spins off and creates a destructive cult, it's usually because some leader has got the notion that God is speaking through him and his voice is special and all of the people need to hear his voice. It's the way it works, right? It's a pattern. But then they go off and they start their own structure, and it's much the same way. They do not they do not present their organization in such a way that can be legally conquered. It's just a movement. It's spontaneous. They like to use words that much like Hobart did. It's an organism. The Branham cults would say we have no organization, but yet they all followed the same strategy. It was like an imprint from cult sect to cult sect. They all looked to Branham as the central figure. There was a hierarchy, clear hierarchy. But while they had that hierarchy chain, they did not have that hierarchy chain on paper. So because it's not on paper, the legal system can't do anything with it.
Yeah, and it's the same with Faith Assembly, and I think they planned it that way. Hill said, "I attend there. We have no membership per se." What do you mean no membership per se? I mean, you know exactly who's regularly showing up. At the very end, they had gotten so tight, they could spot who the members were and who they weren't. So because they're not on an official register or roll, they were experts at this Phariseeism of splitting hairs. You could say you don't have membership because you don't have a membership roll that's actually written by a church secretary and stored in the church office, but you still have a membership. They said, we don't have any rules here that you have to follow, but they had this requirement sheet of 10 things to be in fellowship with Faith Assembly. But then Hobart would say, now that's not a list of rules. Those are just requirements for fellowship with Faith Assembly. There we go. What's the difference between a rule and a requirement? They were just experts at trying to split hairs over things. It drove you nuts trying to listen to them.
They like to take a single word and find another word that is exactly the same and use it instead when there's an argument. But what you find is kind of funny because so they don't use the word rule. If people started saying regulations, then they would flip back to rule. So it's always the circle that I don't know. Have you seen seen these things on the internet? You're supposed to click the button and it moves over here, and you click over here, it moves back. That's the way they do. They're that dodgy with their words.
Well, he said, while Freeman was alive, he used the love offerings, which was money placed by members in a box at the rear of the church to pay bills, and then acquired the funds that were left over for his personal use. Since Freeman's death, the funds are given to June Freeman. He said nothing has changed. Even today, Mrs. Freeman continues to pay the church bills, according to Steve Hill. This is all in this, before a judge. The judge is trying to get to the bottom. And I can appreciate how he's having difficulty getting to the bottom because everything is so slippery. If you don't have a legally formed corporation, and I know Hobart was just radically opposed to that, but I don't think there's anything wrong. I think you have to live within the society in which you are. And in order to protect the church and its entity and its assets, because although it is an organism, it is also an organization. I mean, you don't have to be one or the other. You can be both. And I think that's what the church today has to be. You are an organism where every member is in relationship to the other. But if you have property and a building and people that are paid a salary, and you have expenses, you have light bills and property taxes, then you have to have some kind of real legal structure and organization there. Remember, John, back when they built the new building, Don Nye just said, hey, you guys can throw a building up on my farm. I mean, it was incredible. And they built this, huge, basically, just metal shop building. We showed pictures months ago of what it looks like today and what it looked like back then, just on somebody's farm. And I don't remember hearing any, not a single objection or question whenever that was happening. That started back in 1977. They finished the building and moved in the winter of 78. And I think they're all praising God and rejoicing. But nobody is thinking, unless there was a CPA or an attorney with that in their background there in the building, saying, wait a minute, what if someone falls and breaks their leg here? You're on Don Nye's property. That's who they're going to go after, because the rest of this is just a glob called Faith Assembly. It's no legal entity at all. And so what happens when all of these people, John, from literally all over the country made contributions financially? There were whole construction groups that left Ohio and went there and poured all the concrete at their own expense for that building. They're donating this to the church, quote unquote, but there is no church. Who holds the assets? Once you've donated all this, it belongs to Don Nye and his family. And I'm not saying that there's anything evil about that. I'm not saying Don Nye is an evil person or that Don had any evil motives. I'm just asking, where is common sense and reality? What if push comes to shove in the future? And it always does in churches. Push comes to shove eventually. Then who owns what? If Don Nye got really mad, which he didn't, he stayed in agreement, as far as I know, with Hobart to the very end. He could have just said, this is private property and everybody get off the property. And he owns the whole building and the speakers and the sound system and all the chairs and everything. Not that Don did or would ever have done that. I'm just saying that's crazy. That's absolutely irresponsible and immature and crazy for a grown man like Hobart Freeman to accept and encourage a situation like that. And it was equally crazy for everybody else in the church to go along with it.
And it just goes back to the same point I made at the beginning. It's a fantasy world that they've created, but the people have helped to create it. It's not just the cult leader. Everybody's joining into this fantasy world. So they're building this empire that somehow defies all logic, right? But the people see logic in the illogical. That's the other interesting component of this. Psychologically, the people are manipulated to try to find logic in the illogical. And in the end, nobody wins when you're in a cult like this. Just absolutely nobody wins.
No, they don't. And yet, there are still people clinging to Hobart's teaching, which just, absolutely blows me away. Just a couple of more things from the end of this article, pointing again back to Steve Hill. According to Steve Hill, he said this Mrs. Olson only attended his meetings in Illinois on and off for about 1.5 years. So you notice what he's trying to do is distance himself from any relationship with her and therefore any liability. He said he never counseled her. This is a quote, she was just a face. Wow. I'm reminded of what the woman said who was a part of Jeff Barnett's church in New Whiteland for 10 years. She said, we were just a face. I saw him after that. I was there 10 years, she said. He didn't have a clue who I was. These people who had given up everything, laid down everything, deposited everything in the offering box, just a face. And I don't know this woman, I don't know her. I don't know the story, but I know that it sounds suspicious to me for all these ministers. Whenever push comes to shove, they will say, well, I didn't say that, or I don't know the person. Instead of banding with this person, yes, I did teach this. Yes, this is my conviction. And yes, this person was a faithful member in our church for X number of years. So after all of the legal wrangling is over, John, we finally end up in January of 1986. The court had all their information. They were able to release because it was public knowledge by this time, and they're trying to deal with this lawsuit. On January the 16th of 1986, the courts finally had in their hands the financial records that they needed, and this is what the conclusion was: that Hobart Freeman's personal financial worth was put at $341,198.84. And the business entities connected to Hobart Freeman were totaled up to be valued at $584,186.17. If you total all that up, you're just shy of $1 million. And then if you do the math on it in today's money, that's $2.5 or $3 million. So Hobart was a millionaire. He had $1 million. He'd come a long way from having nothing, just trusting God. He'd come a long way to now have a net worth of $1 million. And I'm not saying, because it's not my place to say whether that amount is too little for him, too much for him. That's not my place to say. But it is interesting that he was worth $1 million, and yet we saw the majority of the people in his church rubbing two nickels together and end up with a dime. And no, he did not have a house in Long Beach and a house in Miami and a house in Monte Carlo. He did not have a big garage with a fleet of collector's cars. He did not live in a palatial mansion. I will agree. He did not have all of those things, but he was very well off financially. Did he deserve it? That's not for me to decide. These simply are the facts that he was worth $1 million or close to it. And it just seems to me like there is a huge disparity between what he had and even what the average member in the church had. Did he earn it? Did he deserve it? Was he worth it? That's for all of the people who contributed to his ministry over the years. They can look back and they can answer that question. But I know that he was living in butter, as were the main ministers. They had everything they wanted and then some. They had it all paid for. And what I object to is not what they had, but how they got it. They misled the people. They said, we just trusted God. We obeyed Matthew 6:19-34, where 5 times Jesus said, take no thought. We didn't take thought. We just trusted God. Rather than saying, thank you people so much for your continued financial support of my ministry, because if it were not for you, I would not have what I have today. I don't remember ever, John, hearing any of those ministers make a statement like that. It was always this super spiritual, God has blessed me and God did this and God did that, and never focusing on, it may indirectly have come from God, but it came through the sweat and labor of those people sitting in those chairs out there in front of you. And there needs to be some appreciation and some give and take for that. The people, I'm so appreciative of you as my minister, and the minister, I'm so appreciative for you as the people who have come here to listen.
It's kind of funny because I have Adam, who co-hosts some of the NAR series of the podcast with me, and he is an accountant. And he goes absolutely nuts when people start talking money, because the cult leaders pitch it one way and they talk like it's just this meager amount. But when you do the math and you sum up all the assets, there's a heck of a lot of money there. When William Branham died, people thought that he was dirt poor, and they were giving him pennies to try to help him out. In the aftermath, we learned years later, there was a guy named, Gerald Lee Walker. Gerald Lee Walker was the son of, I think, Orville Walker, if I'm remembering the name correctly, a revivalist in the Latter Rain movement. He was deeply connected to the Full Gospel businessmen at the top, and he did an investigation and to Demas Shakarian, and the leader of the Full Gospel Businessmen, because the money just didn't add up. And long story short, it turned into this big scandal at Full Gospel Businessmen because this money's just going who knows where. Well, the same kind of scandal was kind of emerging in the Branham cults, and he became the attorney for Sarah Branham, which was William Branham's daughter. And she said that when William Branham died, he had, what was it, $3.1 million, I think, in a bank account. And nobody knew this. I mean, this was just shock to the world. And it was exactly the Hobart Freeman scenario. You look at his house and you think, well, this man didn't have any money. And he drove these cars that, yeah, he did have a Cadillac, but there were a lot fancier Cadillacs out there. You could not tell by looking at him that he had this much money, but there was a heck of a lot of money there. And the problem is the people, when they're manipulating them about their own money, rather than just be open and honest and here's the audit trail, you can go look at how our church spends the money and uses the money like any other church out there, they want to conceal where it goes. And in the end, they end up with a lot of assets. And I think people miss it because they're presenting themselves as poor. This is a meager ministry. We need all the help we can get. Give me your money. And I'm going to go put it in a stock somewhere.
Well, I have one final thing, John, I want to wrap this up with, and this may not have anything to do with William Branham, but it was pretty big with Hobart Freeman, and that concerned Hobart Freeman's teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. Hobart Freeman was very well known for teaching and talking about the Sermon on the Mount all the time. Like, we're the only ones. I'm the only one who takes the Sermon on the Mount literally, and I'm the only one who understands it. We're the only ones who practice it. And he was big on not taking an oath in court because the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, let your yea be yea and your nay, nay. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. And just other parts of the Sermon on the Mount. What people don't realize is that Hobart came from a dispensational background with his eschatology. And one thing that the dispensationalists believed was that the Sermon on the Mount was a kingdom ethic that was not for today, that could not be realized today, that was for the millennial period. Hobart comes along teaching that we are to obey Matthew 5-7. These are the principles of Jesus' kingdom by which we are to live right now. What people don't understand is that is one of the hallmark beliefs of the Grace Brethren Church, where Hobart was trained. He did not get this business of Sermon on the Mount teaching and not taking the oath and non-resistance and not serving in the armed forces. He did not get that on his own. He got that because that was where he was trained, and that was a huge belief of the Grace Brethren Church. So one of the things taught in the Sermon on the Mount, if I can just read these couple of verses, I want to read these verses because these are huge because they were favorite passages of Hobart. And then I want to play a clip from one of his sermons. So I'm reading in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 39. I say unto you that you resist not evil. That's where they get their doctrine of non-resistance. But whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man will sue thee at the law and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. Give to him that asketh of thee, and from him that would borrow from thee, turn not away. Let's look at that 40th verse again. If any man takes you to court in a civil lawsuit and sues you and is trying to get your coat, then not only should you give him your coat, but let him have your cloak also. So in a message that Hobart taught entitled Comfort for Troubled Times, he taught it from Romans chapter 8, and it was actually, believe it or not, the last message Hobart Freeman taught. He taught it on October the 24th of 1984. October the 24th, 1984. This lawsuit had been filed in February of 1984.
Dear friends, people are giving up the faith message and giving up faith assembly over finances. And I refuse to give in or give up or compromise. I don't compromise with the media. I don't compromise with the state. I don't compromise my position with the seminary where I taught to keep my job. If I'm not going to compromise over those things, why in the world would I be concerned about losing some money? I'd never compromise over that. I'm not confessing anything. I told him, I don't think you'll get a dime, but it wouldn't matter. Somebody said, what would you do if the court said $5 million, what would it cost you? I said, faith doesn't say what if. Why would I confess that? Even if I had $5 million. You can't get blood out of a turnip anyway. Hallelujah. Well, as I say, if you can smile with it, you can live in it. Or smile in it, you can live with it. Either way. But dear friends, I would die for what I believe. I don't know if you're ready to say that yet, all of you. I would die for what I believe. So what's a financial lawsuit or a threat of prison?
This is almost one of the last sentences of his life. This is what is so amazing. He's in this civil lawsuit. This is the last message he teaches. He is so ill after this, he does not return to the pulpit. And he dies the second week of December of this same year. And he is basically bedfast for the whole month of November. And so what does he say? He's talking about the lawsuit, as we just heard in the clip. And here's what he said. I'm not confessing anything, but I told them, I don't think you'll get a dime. I'm not the first and only one who has objected to that statement in light of Hobart's rabid commitment to the Sermon on the Mount. You cannot take the oath. You cannot serve in the armed forces. A whole lot of what you cannots. And one of the things, and you cannot hire an attorney to represent you in court. And one of the things Jesus said here is if they sue you and try to get some money from you, according to Hobart's view and Hobart's teaching of this, give them the money and then give them some extra to bless them on the way out. But when push comes to shove, what happens with these people? He said they're not going to get a dime. In other words, I'm not giving them any money. Well, that's contrary to what Hobart always taught that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. And that's just been a big problem for the people who have recognize that inconsistency and remember that Hobart said that. Not always, John, can people figure out. This would be how I would close this for everyone, whether a minister is right or wrong based on biblical teaching, because maybe you just yourself just don't know the Bible well enough. That's okay. It's one thing to look for faithfulness to Scripture, which I encourage everyone to do. But there's another tactic you can use, and that is just look for internal consistency in the message of the minister himself. Even if you can't figure out, I don't know if the Bible teaches that or not, I'll tell you, it'll go a long way in helping you if you can just look for internal consistency. That was the first thing that began to trouble me with Dr. Freeman. I saw so many internal inconsistencies. You said this on this tape, then you contradict yourself on that tape. I think if people will look for that, it'll help them out in the future.
I think it will too. What's funny is you can carry that actually a step forward. If you're reading the Bible after you've left one of these groups and you find some passage that just looks totally opposite from what you believe, and you're bringing into your mind different passages that argue with this, a lot of times you go back and you'll find, no, what the Bible actually says is a little bit more cohesive than what we were taught, because what we were taught was so far off. And I've had it happen time and time again. I'll something I'm reading, I'll look at it and I'll think, well, that just doesn't make sense. That doesn't fit. And then I'll go back and I'll reread all of the things that were programmed in my head and find out they just totally twisted it, where you cannot make any sense of the Bible if you believe these teachings. And this is the reason why whenever I'm talking about these movements, I say it's really an anti-biblical movement. It's not even extra-biblical. They're teaching you things that make the Bible fight with itself, and you just can't live like this, man. Especially if you're an intellectual person and you like to think. They don't like this at all. They do not want you to think. So, well, this has been fun. There's so much more we could get into. I guess next time we'll go a little bit deeper. But if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more about the dark side of the New Apostolic Reformation, read Weaponized Religion: From Christian Identity to the NAR. Available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.